The air at the Henderson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, cheap cigar smoke, and the damp, earthy smell of turned soil. It was late March 1973. The frost was finally letting go of the Iowa black dirt, and you could feel the anxious energy of 100 farmers ready to get into the fields. I was there, Silas Blackwood, not to buy much of anything. Maybe an old set of cultivators if they went cheap, or a box of miscellaneous hardware. Mostly, I was there to watch, to take the temperature of the county. My ride was parked out on the lane, a respectable distance from the new pickups. It was my 1951 Farmall Super M, the paint faded to a dull, sun-baked rose, the engine block stained with the ghosts of 20 years of oil and grease. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. Every nut, every bolt, every gallon of high-tran in its belly was paid for. In a world that was starting to run on credit, that felt like a secret strength, a hidden anchor in a rising tide. A shadow fell over me as I was looking over a rusty John Deere flare box wagon. Still running that old relic, sigh. Thought the scrapyard would have claimed it by now. I didn't have to turn around. I knew that voice. Frank Miller. He was 20 years my junior, with a face that had never known a bad harvest and hands that were softer than a banker's. He'd inherited a good quarter section from his father and had been leveraging it to buy up land like the government was fixing to outlaw dirt. I straightened up slowly, wiping my hands on my denim overalls. She starts every time I ask her to, Frank. Can't ask for more than that. Frank let out a short, barking laugh. He gestured with his thumb back towards the road, where a gleaming giant sat parked. It was a brand-new John Deere 4640, the tires as tall as my chest, the green paint so bright it hurt the eyes. The Soundguard cab looked like something out of a science fiction magazine, a clean, quiet bubble of glass and steel. Yeah, well, my new 4640 does a little more than just start, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Got air conditioning, an AM/FM radio, 8-track player, 155 horsepower at the drawbar. I'll have my corn in the ground while you're still on your second pass. Sigh. Time is money. I just nodded. She's a fine-looking machine, Frank. Hope she works out for you. Oh, she'll work out, he said, puffing out his chest. The bank was more than happy to set me up. They know you got to spend money to make money. It's the new way of doing things. Get big or get out? He clapped me on the shoulder, a little too hard. You ought to think about it. Trade in that museum piece. A man your age shouldn't have to work so hard. He walked off then, joining a circle of younger farmers who all looked at his new tractor with a mixture of envy and admiration. I watched him go, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back from a lifetime of sitting on a steel pan seat. He wasn't entirely wrong. My Farmall was hard work. The steering was all arm strength. The noise was deafening. After 12 hours of spring tillage, my bones would hum with the vibration of that 4-cylinder engine for hours after I shut it off. But as I looked from his massive, financed machine to my old, paid-for tractor, I felt a quiet certainty. His tractor belonged to the John Deere dealership, and ultimately to the bank in Des Moines. My Farmall M, every scratch and dent of it, belonged to me. It was a simple truth, but it felt as solid as the anvil in my workshop. I didn't buy anything that day. The prices were sky-high, fueled by optimism and easy credit. Men were bidding on equipment like the price of corn was going to double and never come back down. I just watched, listened, and when the auctioneer finally wrapped up, I climbed onto the familiar seat of my Super M. I pushed the starter rod with my heel. The big flywheel turned, and with a cough of black smoke, the engine barked to life. It wasn't the smooth, quiet hum of Frank's new Deere. It was a rough, throaty roar, a working man's sound. I put it in road gear and started the slow, rumbling journey home, the bare trees of the fence rows just beginning to show the faintest hint of green. The wind was cold, whipping at my face, but I didn't mind. It felt real. Out here, on this open seat, you could feel the weather change, smell the rain coming, hear the meadowlarks in the pasture. You were part of the world, not sealed off from it in a climate-controlled cab with an 8-track playing. Frank Miller's words echoed in my head. Get big or get out. It was the new gospel being preached at the co-op, in the bank, in the pages of Farm Journal. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool, clinging to a past that was gone for good. But another part of me, a deeper, quieter part, believed that debt was a chain, and the freedom of owning your own iron, of owing no man a single dime, was a kind of wealth they couldn't measure on a balance sheet. Before we go any further into this story, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Down in the comments, tell me which side you're on. Are you with Frank Miller, believing you have to borrow big and take risks to get ahead? Or are you with a man like me, who thinks paying cash and owing nothing is the only true way to be free? Let me know which path you think is the right one, because over the next 10 years, Frank and I were about to put both of those philosophies to the ultimate test. The spring of '74 came in wet and cold. The ground was saturated, and every time the sun tried to peek through the slate-grey clouds, another wave of rain would sweep across the plains. It was the kind of weather that tested a man's patience. For Frank Miller, it was an inconvenience. His big 4640 with its dual rear wheels and 4-wheel drive front axle could float over the soft ground, its massive diesel engine barely noticing the extra strain of pulling a 24-foot disc through the mud. He was done planting by the second week of May, his corn rows straight as a ruler, a perfect picture of modern efficiency. For me, it was a different story. My Super M, with its narrow front end and 2-wheel drive, was a different beast altogether. It was lighter, sure, but in the mud, it was a constant battle. I spent more time wrestling the steering wheel, feeling the rear tires slip and bite, than I did looking forward. I got my corn in, but I was 3 weeks behind Frank, and my fields looked ragged by comparison. The talk at the grain elevator was merciless. CC's fields? Looks like a blind man planted 'em with a mule. Heard he got stuck 4 times. Had to pull the tractor out with his old pickup. That's what he gets for being so stubborn. A new tractor would have paid for itself this year alone. I heard it all. A man can't live in a small town and not know what's being said about him. It stung, I won't lie. But pride doesn't pay the bills, and it sure as heck won't fix a broken magneto. The real trouble started in June. I was cultivating for the first time, the Super M chugging along steadily in second gear, the smell of warm engine paint and fresh-turned soil filling the air. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered, coughed twice, and died. Just like that. Silence, except for the ticking of the hot manifold and the cry of a red-winged blackbird in the ditch. I knew that sound. It wasn't fuel. It was spark. I climbed down, my knees cracking, and opened the little inspection door on the side of the International Harvester H4 Magneto. It was the heart of the tractor, the part that sent the life-giving spark to the cylinders. And it was dead as a stone. I spent the rest of the day in the dim light of my workshop. The place smelled of penetrating oil, stale coffee, and a lifetime of hard work. The magneto was on the workbench, its guts spread out on a clean rag. I had the old IH service manual, its pages soft as cloth and stained with the greasy fingerprints of my father and his father before him. The problem was the impulse coupling. A little spring-loaded dog was supposed to catch and release, giving the magneto a hot, fast spin for starting. But the spring had snapped, a tiny piece of metal no bigger than my thumbnail. Without it, the tractor was just 4,800 pounds of useless iron. I drove into town to the Case IH dealer. The parts man, a young kid named Donny, who wouldn't know a magneto from a mailbox, just stared at his computer screen. H4 magneto. Impulse spring, he mumbled. Nope, obsolete. They haven't made that part in 15 years. We can order you a whole new magneto conversion kit, though. Only $300. $300. For a tractor I could have bought for $500 just a few years ago. It might as well have been $3,000. No thanks, Donny, I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. I'll figure something out. As I walked out, Frank Miller was walking in. He was clean, wearing a fresh seed corn cap, and he gave me a look that was part pity, part, I told you so. Broke down again, Si? He asked, not unkindly. You know, the Deere dealership has a great trade-in program. They'd probably give you scrap value for that old thing. I'll keep that in mind, Frank, I said, and walked past him out into the glaring sun. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. I tried to make a new spring out of piano wire, but it was either too brittle or too weak. I spent hours with a magnifying glass and a set of tiny files, trying to braze the old one back together. But it was no use. All the while, the weeds were growing in my fields, wrapping their greedy roots around my young corn, and the sun was baking the uncultivated ground into a brick-hard crust. My wife, Martha, would bring me out iced tea and sandwiches, her face a mask of worry. She never said a word, never once said, I told you so. But I knew what she was thinking. On the third night, I was about to give up. I was sitting on an upturned bucket, staring at the disassembled magneto, the smell of failure thick in the air. Then I remembered something my dad had told me. Anything man-made, he'd said, can be fixed by a man. I thought about the design of the impulse coupling. The spring's only job was to provide tension. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to pull. My eyes scanned the workshop, over the coffee cans full of bolts, the shelves of old parts, the clutter of a lifetime. And then I saw it. Hanging on a nail was a collection of old carburetor return springs from a half-dozen different engines I'd torn apart over the years. One of them, from an old Briggs & Stratton engine off a defunct water pump, looked about right. It was the wrong shape, but the wire was the right thickness. I spent the next 2 hours with 2 pairs of needle-nose pliers, carefully, painstakingly, bending and twisting that little spring, trying to replicate the shape of the broken one from memory. My fingers cramped, and I cursed under my breath 12 times. Finally, it looked close. With trembling hands, I reassembled the impulse coupling. I slid the magneto back into the tractor, my knuckles getting scraped raw in the tight space. I set the timing by feel, turning the engine over by hand until I felt the compression on cylinder number 1, lining up the marks on the distributor rotor. I reconnected the plug wires, took a deep breath, and climbed back onto the seat. I pulled the choke, cracked the throttle, and pushed the starter rod. The engine turned over, slow and sluggish. And then it happened. A single, sharp crack from the impulse coupling, followed by a loud pop from the exhaust pipe, then another, then a ragged, stumbling rhythm as the engine caught fire. I pushed the choke in, and the old Farmall settled into its familiar, loping idle. Pop, 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 pop. I have never, in my entire life, heard a more beautiful sound. I leaned my forehead against the warm steering wheel and just listened, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washing over me. I had done it. I had beaten the breakdown. I hadn't spent $300. I had spent 3 days of my life, a gallon of sweat, and a fair bit of my sanity. But I had won. The next morning, I was back in the field, the cultivator kicking up clouds of dust as I tore the weeds from my corn rows. I was weeks behind, and my yields would suffer for it. But as Frank Miller drove by on the gravel road in his air-conditioned pickup, I just gave him a simple wave. He could have his easy way. I had mine. And for now, that was enough. The next few years were like a fever dream for the American farmer. The world, it seemed, was starving, and we were the ones to feed it. In late '72, the Russians had made a massive grain purchase, and the effect was like throwing a match into a can of gasoline. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.10, $1.20 a bushel for as long as I could remember, suddenly shot past $2, then $3. Soybeans went through the roof. It was a boom, the likes of which nobody had ever seen. The change in the county was immediate and profound. Money was flowing like water. Farmers who had driven 10-year-old Chevrolets were suddenly showing up to church in brand-new Cadillac Coupe de Ville. Barns got new coats of paint. Wives got new kitchens. And the land, my God, the land. A good acre of Iowa dirt that you might have paid $400 for in 1970 was now fetching $2,000, then $3,000 at auction, and the banks were lending money for it like it was a sure bet. Frank Miller was the poster boy for the new prosperity. He was no longer just farming his inherited quarter section. He used the soaring value of his land as collateral to buy the 80 acres to the east of him. Then he bought the full half section to his north when old man Hemmings retired. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it with the newest, biggest equipment money could buy. His 4640 was traded in for a monstrous John Deere 86-630, an articulated 4-wheel drive that could pull a 12-bottom plow and hardly break a sweat. He put up 2 massive new grain bins with automatic augers and drying fans, their silver corrugated steel glinting in the sun like monuments to his success. To everyone at the diner, Frank was a genius, a visionary. He was playing the new game and winning big. "Did you see Frank's new tractor?" they'd say over coffee. "Thing's a beast. Heard he locked in a contract for $5 corn. That boy's going to be a millionaire before he's 40. Meanwhile, I just kept on doing what I'd always done. The high grain prices were good to me too. For 3 years in a row, I had the best profits of my life. But I didn't see it as a new permanent reality. I saw it as a gift, a rare chance to shore up my defenses. The first good year, I took the profits and paid off the last of the mortgage on my original 160 acres. The feeling of walking out of the bank holding that paid-in-full deed was 100 times better than driving any new tractor off the lot. The next year, I put a new steel roof on the barn and resided the house. I bought Martha the new Kenmore gas stove she'd wanted for a decade. The rest of the money went into a savings account at the First National Bank, earning a modest but steady 5% interest. I kept running the Super M, my old John Deere A, and the little Ford 8N for utility work. I replaced parts when they wore out, kept the oil changed, and the grease fittings full. My equipment wasn't shiny, but it was sound. My discipline was seen as foolishness. My caution was mistaken for a lack of ambition. More than once, someone would pull me aside. Say, that 80 acres next to you is for sale. You should jump on it. The bank will loan you the money in a heartbeat. You're sitting on a gold mine, Silas. You need to use that equity to expand. You're getting left behind. Frank Miller even stopped by one afternoon, pulling his shiny new Ford F-250 up the lane. He got out, leaving the diesel engine running, the air conditioner blasting. "See," he said, getting right to the point. "I've been thinking. You're not getting any younger. This place, it's too small to be efficient. I'll make you a fair offer. Cash. You and Martha could retire, move to town, buy a condo in Florida for the winters." It wasn't a friendly offer. It was a predator's offer, dressed up in neighborly concern. He saw my small, paid-for farm not as a home, but as an asset to be absorbed into his growing empire. "Thanks for the offer, Frank," I said calmly, not taking my eyes off the piece of cultivator shovel I was welding. "But Martha and I are happy right where we are. This farm isn't just a business to us. It's home." He just shook his head, a little smirk on his face. "Suit yourself, old man," he said, as he climbed back into his truck. "But don't come crying to me when you can't make it anymore." The feeling that I was a relic, a dinosaur waiting for the meteor, was hard to shake. Every trip to town was a fresh reminder. New tractors, new combines, new grain trucks were everywhere. The machinery dealers were building huge new showrooms. The whole world seemed to be caught up in a frenzy of borrowing and buying, convinced that the good times would never end. But I'd seen enough seasons come and go to know that nothing lasts forever. I'd listened to the news on the radio in the barn at night. The reports were always good. Exports were up. Prices were strong. But sometimes a different story would peek through. An economist talking about runaway inflation. A mention of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates by 1/4 of a point to cool things down. They were just whispers then, little hints of a gathering storm far out on the horizon. One Sunday after church, my banker, a decent man named Tom Peterson, pulled me aside. He looked tired, older than his years. "See," he said, his voice low. "I see what you're doing, putting money away, staying out of debt. You keep doing that." "Things are good, Tom," I said. "Why the long face?" He looked around the church parking lot, at all the new cars and trucks. "It's too good," he whispered. "This can't last. The government is printing money like there's no tomorrow to pay for that war in Vietnam and everything else. Inflation is eating us alive. To fight it, they're going to have to raise interest rates. And not by a little, Si, by a lot." He looked me square in the eye. "All these fellas, like Frank Miller, they're all on variable rate loans. They think they're geniuses now, paying 7%. What happens when that rate goes to 12, or 15, or 20? He let the question hang in the air. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I looked across the fields of black dirt, at the towering grain elevators in the distance, at the whole sprawling, supercharged enterprise of American agriculture. It all looked so strong, so permanent. But Tom's words made me see it for what it was. A beautiful house built on a foundation of borrowed money, with a hurricane spinning just out of sight. And I knew, right then and there, that the real test hadn't even begun. The first sign of trouble wasn't a headline in the Des Moines Register or a notice from the bank. It was the sky. The summer of 1979, the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. Day after day, it was the same. The sun would come up like a brass tack in the east and burn its way across the heavens, sucking the moisture from the ground, from the leaves of the corn, from the very air itself. The rain, which had been so plentiful just a few years before, simply stopped. By mid-July, my corn was suffering. The broad leaves, which should have been a deep, waxy green, were curled up tight like cigars, trying to protect themselves from the relentless heat. The tassels were coming out, but they were pale and anemic. Down at the co-op, the old-timers would look at the rain gauge, shake their heads, and say things their fathers had said during the 30s. The squirrels are burying their nuts deep this year. The corn is talking to us and it's begging for a drink. For me, the drought was a worry, a deep, gnawing anxiety that sat in my gut. But my costs were low. My biggest expense was the diesel fuel for the Super M, and that old 4-cylinder engine was about as thirsty as a camel. I had my savings in the bank, a cushion against the inevitable lean year. For Frank Miller, the drought was a catastrophe in the making. He was farming 1,000 acres of thirsty corn, and every single acre was mortgaged to the hilt. His operating loan for that year alone was more than my entire farm was worth. He had the big equipment, but you can't plow your way out of a drought. His massive John Deere 8630 sat idle in its shed most of the summer, its $100,000 price tag gathering dust while the interest clock kept ticking. He tried to fight it. He bought a massive irrigation rig, a center pivot system that looked like a giant mechanical water spider, and set it up on the half-section north of his home place. He had to drill a deep well to feed it, another $50,000 of borrowed money. The diesel engine that ran the pump roared day and night, a constant, desperate prayer for a good crop. But he could only water 160 acres. The rest of his land just baked. The real blow came one hot afternoon in August. I was out mending fence along the line between my property and Frank's, and I saw his big John Deere tractor crawling across one of his parched fields, pulling a chisel plow. It seemed a foolish thing to do, turning over the dry ground and letting what little moisture was left escape into the wind. But I figured he had his reasons. Then, halfway across the field, the tractor just stopped. I watched for a while, leaning on a fence post. I saw Frank get out of the cab, walk around the machine, and kick one of the giant dual tires. I knew that kind of kick. It wasn't a kick of frustration, it was a kick of pure, helpless rage. After a few minutes, he got back in, and I heard the engine try to turn over, but it was followed by a sickening sound, a high-pitched whine, and then a grinding noise that set my teeth on edge. I saw the service truck from the John Deere dealership out there the next day. They had a crane and a flatbed trailer. I watched from my workshop as they spent the better part of the morning disconnecting the front half of that articulated tractor from the back half. They had split it right in the middle. The transmission, I thought. That's the only reason you'd do that. A modern power shift transmission wasn't like the simple sliding gear set up in my Farmall. It was a labyrinth of hydraulic clutches, planetary gear sets, and solenoid valves. It was a mystery that only a factory-trained technician with $1,000 worth of specialized tools could solve. They hauled the back half of his tractor away, leaving the front half sitting in the field like the carcass of some strange, futuristic beast. It sat there for 2 weeks. I saw Frank at the diner a few days later. He looked awful. His eyes were bloodshot, and he'd lost weight. He was usually the center of attention, holding court with the younger farmers. But now he sat by himself at the counter, staring into a cup of coffee. I sat down a couple of stools away. "Tough break on the tractor, Frank," I said quietly. He flinched, then turned to me. "It's the main hydraulic pump," he said, his voice flat and dead. It failed, sent metal shavings all through the system. Took out the transmission, the steering, the whole damn thing. They have to rebuild everything. Every clutch, every valve, every hose. "That sounds expensive," I said, though I already knew the answer. He let out a hollow laugh. Expensive? They're quoting me $22,000, Si. 22 grand. And the parts are on back order from Waterloo. Might not get it back until after harvest. He shook his head, looking down at his hands on the counter. I've got payments on that tractor, bigger than your whole property tax bill, and it's sitting in my field in 2 pieces. He paid for his coffee and left without another word. I watched him go, and I felt a sliver of pity for him. He had built his empire on the promise of modern, efficient machinery. But he had forgotten the other side of that promise. When it breaks, you're not just a farmer anymore. You're a customer, completely at the mercy of the company that holds the patents and prints the parts list. You're a man in a cage of your own making. The harvest of '79 was a grim affair. The drought had slashed yields by more than half. I brought in about 70 bushels to the acre, just enough to break even on my seed and fuel. Frank, even with his irrigated patch, didn't do much better across his whole operation. And then, as if God himself had decided to kick the farmer while he was down, the news came over the radio. The president had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The effect on the market was instantaneous and brutal. The price of corn at the local elevator collapsed, falling from over $3 a bushel to barely $2. All that talk of $5 corn, all that optimism that had fueled the boom, vanished overnight. It was a perfect storm, a terrible crop, and a terrible price for it. It was the first time in a decade that I saw real fear in the faces of the men at the co-op. The cracks in the foundation were starting to show, and everyone could feel the tremor. The winter of 1980 was a long, cold silence. It was as if the whole county was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The price of land, for the first time in years, stopped going up. A few farms went on the market and just sat there with no buyers. The easy credit that had flowed from the banks for a decade suddenly dried up. The whispers started. Heard the bank isn't renewing operating loans this year. The implement dealer is repossessing equipment. Then the letters started arriving. They came in plain white envelopes from banks in Des Moines and Omaha, and they landed in mailboxes like death notices. Inside, the language was cold and formal, talking about prime lending rates and adjustments to your variable rate mortgage. The man from the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, had declared war on inflation, and his weapon of choice was interest rates. The 7% loans that had built Frank Miller's empire were a thing of the past. The rate jumped to 12%, then 15%. By the spring of '81, the prime rate was a staggering 21.5%. For me, it was just a number in the newspaper. My farm was paid for. My savings account, ironically, was now earning a handsome return. But for Frank, and hundreds of others like him, it was a death sentence. His loan payments, which were already a struggle, tripled almost overnight. He was paying more in interest every month than my father had paid for our entire farm. The swagger was gone. The confidence was replaced by a haunted, hunted look. I'd see him driving his pickup, staring straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The new John Deere 8630, finally repaired, was back in the shed. But he couldn't afford the fuel to run it. Instead, he was using his father's old John Deere 4020, a good tractor, but not nearly big enough for the 1,000 acres he was trying to farm. He was falling behind before the season had even started. He sold off what he could. A new grain truck went first. Then the center pivot irrigator was sold for scrap. He let go of the 200 acres he was cash renting. But it wasn't enough. It was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a bucket. The debt was too big, the hole too deep, The value of his land, the very foundation of his collateral, was plummeting. An acre that had been worth $3,000 in 1978 was now struggling to fetch $1,500. He owed the bank more than his entire farm was worth. One afternoon in early summer, I saw the banker's car, a big Lincoln Town car, pull into Frank's lane. It was Tom Peterson. He was in there for over an hour. When he came out, he walked with his head down and got into his car without looking back. A week later, the notice appeared in the county paper, tucked in with the legal announcements. A foreclosure auction. The property of Frank and Carol Miller. 1,000 acres more or less. Full line of late-model farm machinery. Household goods. The day of the auction was cold and grey for June, with a raw wind that felt more like November. It was a mirror image of that day at the Henderson farm years ago, but the mood was entirely different. There was no optimism, no eager bidding. The crowd was thin and somber. It felt like a funeral. Farmers stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They were watching one of their own go under, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. I stood near the back, by an old oak tree. I saw Frank and his wife, Carol, standing on the porch of their house. They looked like strangers at their own party. Carol's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Frank just stared out at the crowd, his expression completely blank, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop. Tools sold for a pittance. An air compressor that was worth $500 sold for $50. Nobody had any money. Nobody had any credit. Then they moved to the machinery. The big Kinzer planter, the one Frank had been so proud of, sold for less than what he still owed on it. The gleaming 7-720 combine, with its air-conditioned cab and grain monitor, went for a third of its original price to a salvage dealer from Kansas City. Finally, they came to the centerpiece, the John Deere 86-630. It sat there in the yard, a monument to a broken dream. The auctioneer tried his best, his voice echoing off the side of the barn. "All right, folks, here she is, the king of the field. Who'll start the bidding at $50,000? $40. Who'll give me $30? Silence. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves of the oak tree. The farmers just looked at it, this giant machine that represented everything that had gone wrong. It was too big, too thirsty, too expensive to fix. It was a relic of an era of cheap money and boundless optimism, and that era was dead. Finally, a man in a clean suit representing a big corporate farm from Illinois made a bid. $20,000. The auctioneer tried to get another bid, but there was nothing. "Sold!" he cried, and the sound of the gavel was like a gunshot. $20,000 for a tractor that had cost Frank over $100,000 just a few years before. I watched Frank flinch when the gavel fell. It was the only emotion he had shown all day. He had tied his dream to that machine, and now it was being hauled away for pennies on the dollar by a stranger. They sold the land last, parcel by parcel. The out-of-state corporation bought up the sections he had added on, their lawyer paying with a cashier's check. Finally, they came to the last piece, the original 160 acres, the home place. The land Frank's grandfather had homesteaded, the ground his father had worked his entire life. The bidding was slow. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. The corporate lawyer started the bidding low. I saw a tear finally trace a path through the dust on Carol Miller's cheek. Frank put his arm around her. I took a deep breath. I had come with my checkbook, tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. Martha and I had talked about it for a long time. It was all the money we had saved during the good years. It was our security, our safety net. But looking at Frank and Carol on that porch, I knew what I had to do. I raised my hand. 30,000, I said. My voice was louder than I expected. Heads turned. The corporate lawyer looked irritated. He bid 31. 35, I said, my heart starting to pound. We went back and forth. The price climbed. 40,000. 45. It was more than the land was worth in that market. But this wasn't about the market. This was about something else. The lawyer finally stopped at 49,000. The auctioneer looked at me, all my savings, everything. 50,000, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The lawyer shook his head and turned away. The auctioneer pointed at me. Sold to Silas Blackwood for $50,000. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I didn't look at anyone. I just walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers, my hands trembling slightly. I could feel Frank's eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. Not yet. A few days later, after the paperwork was all filed at the courthouse, I drove my old pickup down Frank's lane. He was loading the last of their personal belongings into a U-Haul trailer. He looked up as I got out, his face a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. See, he said, his voice raspy. I don't know what to say. Why did you do it? It's good land, Frank, I said simply. Your grandfather picked a good spot. I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It wasn't a deed. It was a simple, one-page rental agreement I'd typed up on Martha's old typewriter. I'm too old to farm another 160 acres, I said, handing it to him. I was hoping you and Carol might be interested in renting the place. Cash rent. The rate is low, just enough to cover the property taxes and give me a little back for my trouble. He stared at the paper, then at me. His eyes welled up. The pride that had defined him for so long finally broke. After everything I said to you, he choked out. After how I treated you. The ground doesn't care about any of that, Frank, I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. It just needs someone to take care of it. Your family has been taking care of this piece of ground for a long time. Seemed a shame to stop now. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He took the paper. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't the empire he had dreamed of. But it was a chance. It was a way to stay on the land. It was a lifeline. The years that followed were hard for everyone. But the fever broke. The talk at the diner changed. It wasn't about the newest, biggest tractor anymore. It was about survival. It was about who could fix their own equipment, who had a good garden, who had managed to stay out of the banker's office. Slowly, quietly, my way of doing things didn't seem so foolish anymore. Men would stop me at the co-op, asking how I kept that old Farmall running so well, asking my advice on rebuilding a carburetor or setting the timing on a magneto. I wasn't a relic anymore. I was a survivor. Frank and Carol stayed. He sold his father's 4020 and bought an old International 806, a good, simple tractor he could afford and fix himself. He farmed that 160 acres with a quiet intensity I'd never seen in him before. He wasn't trying to conquer the world anymore. He was just trying to make a living. We became neighbors in a way we never had been when he was on top of the world. We'd help each other during harvest. I'd lend him a tool. He'd help me hoist an engine block. There was a quiet respect between us, forged in the fire of the crisis. My grandson, young Eli, grew up in the shadow of those hard times. When he was about 10 years old, he loved nothing more than to ride with me on the old Super M. He'd sit on the fender, holding on tight, his face lit up with joy as we cultivated the corn. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, he asked me, "Grandpa, why don't we get a new tractor? One with a cab and a radio?" I throttled the engine down to a low idle and looked at him. "Well, Eli," I said, "that tractor over there in Frank's shed, his International, it belongs to him. This one," I patted the faded red fuel tank, "this one belongs to us. There's a difference." He looked puzzled. "What's the difference?" "Freedom," I said. "This old tractor doesn't have a radio, but it also doesn't have a payment book. It means I don't have to answer to any man in a suit at a bank. It means when we sell our corn, the money is ours. It means we decide what to plant and when to plow. This piece of iron, as old and rusty as it is, buys us our freedom. Never forget that. The most expensive thing you can ever own is a cheap loan." He was quiet for a long time, just listening to the pop, pop, pop of the engine. I don't know if he understood it all then, but I knew I had planted a seed. I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled, and my back aches in the morning. Eli does most of the heavy work on the farm, but he still lets me take the Super M out for a round or two when the mood strikes me. It always starts, that faithful old engine. Frank bought his 160 acres back from me about 10 years ago, paying me exactly what I'd paid for it. Not a penny more. We shake hands at church every Sunday. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I'll walk out to the edge of the fields and just look. The land is still here. The black dirt is still rich and deep. The big corporate farms are bigger than ever, and the tractors they use now are guided by satellites and look like spaceships. But here and there, tucked away in the folds of the hills, you can still find farms like mine. Small places, paid for with sweat and caution, run by people who understand that the goal isn't to get big, but to stay. I look at that old Farmall sitting in the shed, its paint faded, its tires cracked with age. It's not a museum piece. It's a testament. It's a reminder that true wealth isn't about the shine on the paint or the horsepower under the hood. It's about the quiet satisfaction of a day's work done with tools you own, on land you're free to walk, under a sky that asks for nothing but your patience and your faith. It's about owing no man anything but kindness, and that is a harvest that never fails.